Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody to another GGP Zoom event. And tonight I'm really excited to introduce two people who I consider good friends. So our special guest tonight is Scott James. And I have known Scott, we were trying to figure out the other day, we think it's close to 20 years, maybe 15. But Scott has written an amazing book called Trial by Fire, which has been getting some awesome reviews. And for those of you who don't know, Scott is a contributor to the New York Times. And we're going to talk with Frances Dinkelspiel. And Frances is a huge supporter of GGP. She has been there with me since the very beginning, 15 years ago. And she is an acclaimed author in her own right. And she's also the founder of Berkeley Side, which is one of the #1 Bay Area top news sites. So why don't you join me in welcoming Scott and Frances here to a great good place for books. Take it away, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. Well, I'm really looking forward to our conversation, Scott, about this incredible book, Trial by Fire, a devastating tragedy, 100 lives lost, and a 15-year search for the truth. 15 years, that's a long time. And, you know, there's a lot to talk about, but you have a short video that you want to show all the people who are looking that'll give an introduction to what the book is about. So why don't we start with that video?
All right. So, well, first of all, I want to thank Kathleen for having us. Kathleen, you know, it's been one of my dreams as a writer to be on Kathleen's table in her store. And I stopped by the other day and saw my book on the table, the famous table of her recommended books. I was really touched to see that. And thank you to Frances for being the facilitator and the questioner tonight. So Frances is right. This book is about a terrible tragedy that took place some years ago. And I have a brief video that kind of explains the premise of the book. And it will also probably ring a lot of bells for people who may remember this terrible disaster that happened in 2003. So I'm going to grab the screen. I'm going to play that for you now.
It was a night like any other, a festive club filled with laughter and fun. But as we all know, it will be a night that would always be remembered.
February 20th, 2003. The aging rock band Jack Russell's Great White performed at The Station, a small roadside nightclub in the old New England mill town of West Warwick, Rhode Island. The show began with fireworks, 15-foot blasts in a club with 12-foot ceilings. A trickle of flame crawled up the wall. Moments later, columns of fire. In seconds, the stage and then the club became an inferno. 100 killed, hundreds hurt. The deadliest single building fire in modern American history, the nation's deadliest rock concert. As families mourned their dead and burn victims struggled to survive, the questions were overwhelming. Was this an accident or a crime? The nightclub had passed government fire and safety inspections. Why did it go up like a torch? Jack Russell and Great White claimed they had permission for fireworks at their shows and had no clue they were dangerous. A federal investigation recreated the disaster in a lab and showed deadly black smoke took the lives of those inside just 90 seconds after the fire started. No time for everyone to escape. Were there too many in the club? In the panic, there was a stampede toward one exit, causing a bottleneck. Why not use the other 3 exits? The government pointed fingers and filed criminal charges, but those accused did not include Jack Russell and his bandmates. For survivors and families struggling to recover, there seemed to be no justice. And in the end, there were never any trials, not criminal, not civil. That meant the government's version of events was never vetted in court.
People think that the legal system is a search for the truth, and it is not.
It's a search for a result.
A result that left unanswered questions.
See, the story of the station nightclub fire is the story of loss, but it is also the story of the triumph of the human spirit. First responders rushing to the scene, strangers risking their own lives to pull each other out of the smoke.
Now, a fuller explanation of what happened has emerged. Key figures have shared what they know for the first time. A story of people put through a crucible, of survivors, heroes, victims, villains, of a system that's supposed to be there to protect us.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and we're going to talk about the tragedy and the book. But one other thing you'd want to know about this disaster is that it was all captured on videotape from the inside of the nightclub. It just happened to be that there was a local TV news crew there inside the building doing a story, you can't make this up, about public venue safety. And so they were videotaping, recording as the band took the stage, as the band lit off the fireworks. And so you see this disaster unfold. And that video is very rare. Back in, in 2020, we're very used to the idea of everything being caught on tape. But in 2003, the iPhone had not yet been invented. And so capturing disasters on video was extremely rare. And to have a professional news crew actually be there and recording was unbelievably rare. I mean, you have to look at like the Hindenburg disaster in 9/11 to find something similar. And so the video went viral. It was seen all over the world by tens of millions of people. I talked to people who were on a remote Greek island and saw the fire happening on television, the same as I saw it happening back here in California as events unfolded. So it is one of the most documented disasters in the history of the United States. And yet there were still so many unanswered questions about this terrible tragedy.
So let's try to answer some of those questions in the course of our conversation. But before we do that, I was hoping you could tell people about why you're interested in this story. As you say, you were here in the Bay Area when the fire happened. Why write about something all the way back in Rhode Island?
Well, I grew up there. I grew up in a suburb of Providence. And if you know a little bit about Rhode Island, it's the smallest state in the United States. So it's really like a city state. Everything is a suburb of Providence. So I grew up in a suburb of Providence. And I would go home and see my family all the time. And when I went back, I would hear these questions about this terrible tragedy. It was really the worst thing to happen where I grew up. And people thought that they had never been told the whole story, and they felt that their justice had never been served. And so about 10 years ago, I started to ask some questions.
So let's talk about those questions you asked. Maybe we can start with trying to sort of unpack the story. And maybe you could tell listeners a little bit about the two brothers who own the nightclub, your connection to them, and sort of, what their vision was for the nightclub and what ended up happening.
Well, earlier in my journalism career, I had been the news director at one of the local TV news stations there in Providence. And one of the people who worked for me, this is more than 25 years ago, was a reporter named Jeffrey Didarian. And Jeffrey turned out to be one of the co-owners of the nightclub. And in fact, he would face criminal charges for what prosecutors said was his role in the disaster. And so when I started asking questions, I thought, well, the first person I'm going to go to is Jeffrey, because I knew him. And I discovered that Jeffrey and his brother Michael, who owned the nightclub business, they didn't own the actual building, but they owned the nightclub business, had never done an interview with a reporter, which is fascinating to me considering that Jeffrey was a reporter. He was part of the news media. He was the type of guy who, when he worked for me, he was the type of person that chased the bad guys down the street. I mean, you've seen those people on TV. They're the ones who stand outside the courthouse and, ask the guy, did you do it? Did you do it? As they got the camera in their face. That was Jeffrey. That was his job. And then in this awful kind of reversal of fortune, he became the person accused of being the bad guy. And he was the one that they were chasing down the street, basically saying, did you do it? Did you do it? So I come into the picture many years later, and I think, well, I want to hear what Jeffrey has to say, that he had never told his story. But it turned out that he hated the news media. He hated reporters. He hated for the way he thought he was treated during the coverage of this disaster. And so he and his brother had vowed never to speak to a reporter. It took me years to gain his trust, to get him to tell me anything, and then years more to introduce him to his brother. And eventually they shared with me some of what would have been their defense had this ever gone to trial. And one of the things I learned fairly early in the process was that there had been 3 mock trials. So we know what a trial is. When a mock trial is basically where before the trial, the prosecutors and the defense get together and have, not to get together themselves, they stage different kind of practice trials using people who are representatives of the type of jurors that are going to hear the case in real life. So there were 3 of these mock trials between the defense and the prosecutors. And it turned out that no one would convict the brothers, the accused in this case. And so that made me wonder, what is it that those jurors heard that the public had not heard that made them decide that these were not the people who were really guilty in this particular criminal case?
How did Michael and Jeffrey end up owning a nightclub? I mean, and what did they do to, bring this on?
Well, that's a great question, because neither of these 2 guys, they were just regular kind of working class guys. Their background, their dad owned a grocery store that they worked at when they were kids. And then later in life, Jeffrey went on to work in journalism. Michael went on to work in the financial services business. And then at some point, Jeffrey realized that being in television news was not exactly the most stable career to have for a long-term future. I mean, and as Frances knows, journalism is in an upheaval. That was starting to happen. And so he went to his brother, who was a businessman, and said, let's try to do a business venture together. And they looked at various things. I think they tried to buy a laundromat. It fell through. And so they saw this nightclub business was for sale, and they decided to purchase it and try their hand at that. And that's what brought them to owning a nightclub when they weren't people from show business, certainly not in the rock and roll tradition.
Mm-hmm. So can we just take a look at that night and talk about what went wrong? I mean, as you said in the video, there was this band, it looks like, a heavy metal band of sorts, and they shot off these pyrotechnics. And for some reason, the pyrotechnics just completely, exploded and filled the nightclub with black smoke that suffocated a lot of people. Can you talk a little bit about why that happened? I mean, you say the nightclub passed all the inspections. What was going on that things went so badly?
So first of all, the fireworks were 15-foot fireworks in a club with 12-foot ceiling. So that was not the brightest idea to begin with. And the fireworks were illegal. They were not allowed under local law. But what the band didn't know was that the walls of the nightclub had been covered with foam. And the foam was meant to be soundproofing, to prevent the sound of the rock and roll club from eking out of the building into the neighborhood, where neighbors had complained bitterly for many, many years that the club was too loud and was keeping them up at night. So this soundproofing foam was all over the walls, but it wasn't sound foam, even though the intention and the brothers actually bought sound foam, which by law is supposed to be fireproof, fire resistant. Instead, on their walls was packing foam. And packing foam is like solid gasoline. It's an accelerant. In fact, they said later an investigation showed that they had the equivalent of 13 gallons of gasoline on their walls. So when those fireworks hit that foam, that flammable foam, the place went up like a torch. And within seconds, the fire in some places inside the club got to be more than 1,400 degrees. So you have these people who are all trying to get out, And that's where the next twist of this disaster happens, is most people headed towards where they came in. It's kind of our instinct, kind of our lizard brain, so to speak, to say that the way out is the way we came in. But when you have hundreds of people all going for the same door at the same time, that's a problem. That's part of the reason why the other exits were not really utilized to get people, to let people escape, and why so many people died. 100 people died. If you were in that fire at the 90-second mark, you most likely perished. And that's why things went wrong so quickly. And there are a number of factors. It's kind of like, this was described as kind of the perfect storm of fires, because so many things went wrong at the same time. The building did not have sprinklers. It was an older building and it was not required to have sprinklers. Well, why do we have buildings, where public venues, where hundreds of people are allowed to gather and there's no sprinklers? Sprinklers are a technology that dates back to the 1800s, but it wasn't there. So that's another thing that went wrong. All of these things went wrong. And frankly, if just one of them had not gone wrong, every person would have survived.
So I just want to go back to the foam. So did the brothers put in the packing foam as opposed to the sound foam to save money?
No, I mean, they didn't know. I mean, from the evidence that I've looked at, one of the things that is kind of a revelation in the book that the public gets to see is the order. The order they asked for sound foam. And sound foam is by law supposed to be flame retardant, flame resistant. And that's not what they received. And the two types of foam, highly flammable foam and sound foam that's not flammable, they look identical. There's nothing distinguishes them. In fact, a foam expert went and looked at the club after the foam had been installed, touched it, stood right up against it, and he didn't see that it was not the correct type of foam. So for people who are not in the foam business, they certainly wouldn't have had a chance to recognize something dangerous, but even an expert didn't know by looking at it and even touching it, that it was highly flammable foam that had been put inside.
So this is information that really that didn't come out at the time of the fire. And I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of the community's reaction to the fire, the police department's reaction to the fire, because it seems like there were a series of steps that the police took and then the media took, that instead of opening up the investigation, allowing Rhode Island, officials to sort of find out what was going on, and it had the opposite effect. And the investigation closed down. And that's what's so interesting about your book. Coming in, many years later, you're able to actually finally share the true information about what happened that evening. And that hasn't really come out in a long period of time. So talk about what the officials did wrong and what the media did wrong.
Well, there were several people who are kind of key figures in this tragedy who never told their side of the story until this book. And that happened for a variety of reasons. So the brothers are a classic example. So on the night of the fire, the local police chief says to the Associated Press, without doing any investigation whatsoever, he says that the brothers, the nightclub business owners, are most definitely going to be indicted. So once he says that sets off a chain of events, kind of a domino effect. So until that becomes public, and it was carried all over by the press, including on Fox News, the brothers had been cooperating with the investigators and the prosecutors and the police because they felt that they were victims. I mean, their club, the people came in, set off illegal fireworks, the club burned to the ground. They didn't know, and frankly, a lot of people didn't understand the component about the foam initially. All they knew is that the place went up like a torch and it should not have burned so quickly. So there was a lot of questions. But while these questions have not been answered, and while they're out there, this statement is made by the police. Of course, the brothers then are told immediately by their attorneys to stop talking to investigators because the investigators had already jumped to a conclusion before doing their investigation. So it seemed like a classic rush to judgment happened. So the brothers have a lot of information that they can share. I mean, they're the ones who own this business. They run this business. They have the answers to a lot of questions, but they are not going to cooperate because of this rush to judgment. So that's a problem. I think another thing that people felt that, that justice was not served in this case is because local law had no ability to hold anyone accountable for the injuries. You know, we're talking about the 100 people who were killed, but there were hundreds more that were hurt, and some of them gravely injured and suffered injuries that they will have to deal with for the rest of their lives. But the local law had no ability to hold a single person accountable for those who were injured. And it sounds just incredible. But because of that, you have hundreds of people, and then the people who they're connected to, literally a ripple effect of thousands, who feel that the system like completely turned its back on them and abandoned them in their hour of need. So there's that. So there's this rush to judgment, there's this feeling that justice was not served. This all combines into just a terrible amount of agony and heartache and anger and rage that the community goes through as this terrible disaster unfolds.
Mhm. And how did like the Providence Journal, the main paper in the state, sort of pile on and help sort of, you know, obfuscate the truth? Like,
Well, the media certainly did not help. So remember I talked about that videotape, and it turned this story into kind of a viral sensation before we even used words like viral sensation. So because of this videotape, media comes in. First of all, the scale of the tragedy is unbelievable. I mean, it really is the deadliest single building fire in modern American history. And I count modern American history when it comes to fire code is ever since the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire, where 165 people died. After that, the codes changed, and frankly, the death toll in the United States plummeted, and it stayed at a fairly steady level for a long time because modern codes were adhered to. So the tragedy, the epic scale of the tragedy gets attention. Then the videotape makes it into something else, makes it almost like a feeding frenzy of media showing up in this tiny little town of West Warwick, Rhode Island. So there's a lot of pressure on the media to get a scoop and to get ahead of everyone else. And so what happens is that there's a very powerful local newspaper, the Providence Journal, and almost immediately there is a kind of an effort to control the narrative. And there's a great scene in the book told from the perspective of two of the most powerful men in the state. You have the Governor Carcieri, and Joel Rawson, the editor-in-chief of the local newspaper. And they get into a very intense battle. And you were there as the reader, like a fly on the wall, in the room, as they get into it and fight to see who's going to control the narrative of this story. Well, the Dedarians, because they have that statement by the police, they don't not stop talking to the investigators. They also won't talk to the media. Their lawyers like, we're not going to try this in the media. We're going to try this in a court of law. They've already said that you're guilty, so you're going to probably be indicted and you probably have to stand trial. So we're not going to do this in the newspaper. Well, that doesn't go over very well. And what you see emerge almost immediately is a real intense focus on the brothers to ignore almost everything else in the case. So by my account, in the weeks and months following the fire, the Providence Journal did 122 stories where the brothers are the focus or the main part of the story. And during the same time period, literally the guy who ignited the bomb, who lit off the fireworks that led to the fire that killed all these people, there are only 18 stories about him. So the coverage seems very lopsided, and certainly the brothers see that. Then 2 months after the fire, they run a story on their front page, a 6-column Sunday headline about how that the brothers have this quote unquote legacy of death. So the legacy of death story, which is done 2 months to the day of the fire, when it's hard to describe the outrage and the agony and the pain that this state is going through at that point. So this big story expose basically ties the fact that the brothers, who are of Armenian descent, so they get into the fact that they are Armenian heritage. The Armenians, as some of you might know, were the victims of a genocide at around the time of World War I. So this is the first clue in the newspaper's legacy of death that they put on the brothers, that they are Armenian, so they have this genocide past. Their heritage was as victims of the genocide, but that, it's put in there. After that, they talk about how that their mother died when they were children. So that's part 2 in this legacy of death. And eventually it goes to the nightclub fire and the tragedy there. So after the brothers saw that headline that tied their past together in this weird way to describe that they had a legacy of death that seemed to follow them wherever they go, they decided, that was the day they decided never ever to speak to a journalist again, until they spoke to me all these years later. So because of that, you didn't get all of this information. Frankly, the information that those mock jurors got, that when they considered it, said that the brothers were not the people who were culpable for this disaster.
Wow. So, I was lucky enough to get this book in galley form, and I just raced through it. And then I gave it to my husband, Gary, and he raced through it. We just both so enjoyed the book. And it's a tragic book, but of course, as you talk about in the video, the triumph of the human spirit is all there. And I was hoping that you might be able to tell us a little bit about a few of the people that you focus on in the book that sort of become the main characters to carry the story. And I think that's the reason the book is so compelling to read, is you really have discovered so much information about these people and why they were at the nightclub and what they experienced in the building and how they sort of survived and repaired themselves afterwards. And I'm wondering if you could just share one or two anecdotes about these people.
Sure.
And it really feels like you got to be very, very close to them after, in the way you describe them.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've been talking all this time about kind of the the nuts and bolts of the story and the legal case and the investigation. But you're right, Frances, at the heart of this is a story about people. So all that we've talked about here, all the journalism we've discussed, is really kind of on the edges. The central focus are these handful of people who we follow from before, during, and after the disaster. And we see the story through their eyes. This is their story. The journalism we all talked about is built around their core stories. And these are the few that represent the many. Remember, we have 100 dead, we have hundreds injured, and a ripple effect of thousands of people's lives are impacted by this. And all of these people deserve to have their stories told. They deserve to be memorialized. They deserve to be heard. But in the confines of a book, I have to pick. And so I pick a handful of people to follow, but they're not random people. These are people who, before, during, and after the fire, are there to bear witness to key moments in this disaster that turn out to be very, very important for us to understand what happened. So one of the people, probably the one whose story, one of a couple of people whose story has a real emotional punch, is a guy named Phil Barr. So remember, this was a rock and roll club, and most of the people there were kind of blue collar, working class folks with tattoos and out to have a great time, there to party. And then in the middle of all this is this guy, Phil Barr, who's a college student at Bates, which is one of the mini Ivies up in Maine. And he happens to be in town. There's a snowstorm. He's kind of stranded at his parents' house. He picks up with a buddy. He loves rock and roll. He decides to go out to this club. And he had tried to get in before, but he was too young. Now he was over 21. He could finally get in to see a show. And so he's very excited to be there for the first time and to see Jack Russell's Great White, who he likes. And so then he finds himself in the middle of this horror in a matter of seconds. And we see how his fate and the fate of so many people just turns on a dime, on a second. Like decisions that people made in a split second will forever impact them for the rest of their lives. Some people who, if we talk about in the book, are judged for making possibly the wrong decision in a split second and are damned by the public for the rest of their lives for a decision they made in a nanosecond. Phil is trampled and basically left for dead. This is a guy who's a college swimmer. He's as you can imagine, incredibly fit, and he's partially blacks out for a moment and finds himself inside this inferno. In fact, he probably might be one of the last people to walk out of that building and live. So he's wounded to the point of near death. Probably comes close to death several times before he recovers. But he goes on to bear witness. He is in the room as decisions are made about how are they going to help people who are suffering awfully from this fire. One of the tragedies built upon a tragedy in all of this is the fact that the social welfare systems that we believe, the institutions that we believe are going to be there to help us in our hour of need, really were not there for the people who were the victims of this fire, either the families of those who perished or the people who survived and needed a lot of help. So it was people like Phil Barr who then even though he was a victim of the fire, even though he was terribly hurt and wounded and had to struggle to survive, he steps up and he helps find a way to get these people the help that they need. It's really an incredible, inspiring story that really touches people.
Mhm. So I guess I think we should just wrap up our discussion in order to take some questions. But the legal questions in this incident have been settled. There were no civil trials, no criminal trials, as you say in the video. I'm wondering what the impact has been of your book since it's came out, if it has prompted discussions that have been years in the making. Sort of, what have you seen happen in Rhode Island as a consequence of the book?
Well, I think there are two different types of reactions. I think the reaction in Rhode Island itself, I mean, this is a painful chapter for people to revisit. And so for some people whose lives were directly impacted, this is a very tough book for them. And, I do get those messages. It's too tough for some people. Some people have waited for years to get answers to questions, and for them it may be helpful. There is no closure with something like this. There is no healing. I mean, the people don't come back. People who are gone forever. So it's a really tough for people who lived through this to revisit this material. But of course, we don't write books for only 100 people and their families, or the couple hundred people who were injured. We write books for, hopefully for a larger audience and for the world. And so that possibly that a lesson might be learned. And so what I'm also getting are people from, especially young people from, in the middle of America, who have never heard of this tragedy, did not know about it. And so they're reading this for the first time, and they're looking at this saying, well, wait a minute. I go out all the time, well, when we could go out, and I had no idea that I should really pay attention. I should be looking for exits. Maybe we need to start asking questions about our systems. Are the institutions that are there that are supposed to protect us, are they really protecting us? I could say that one of the legacies of this tragedy was supposed to be that maybe we took some steps to prevent it from happening again. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We saw it happen right here in the Bay Area. We saw it happen in Oakland with the Ghost Ship fire, where we had 36 people died, and a different set of facts, but in some ways very similar, in that here was a building that was a death trap that people were in, that didn't have sprinklers, that wasn't properly inspected. Does any of this ring a bell? This is the same type of setup that led to so many people dying in Rhode Island. And yet only 4 years ago, more people died in Oakland. And so I also thought was interesting in the Ghost Ship case is that, Rhode Island, there was never a trial. The criminal case was settled, the civil case was settled, nobody got their day in court. In Oakland, they did do a big trial. It lasted for months. They put the two guys, the operators of the business, not the owner of the building, again, not the owner of the building, but the operators of the business, they put them on trial, and the jurors refused to convict. They didn't convict either. The one person they completely exonerated. And so that leads to the question, like what's when people consider the entire case and not just a headline that they saw on the news or something that they read in the paper, but when they consider all the facts, jurors are asking questions like saying, well, wait a minute, is this really a situation that involves a couple of individuals, or are we looking at systemic problems that need to be addressed? So yes, when I get a comment either on a review on like Goodreads that says, they've never heard of this case before and they live in Seattle or wherever, those I'm grateful for that, because that's really what I'm trying to say here with this book and reopen this case, is that there was a warning that was not heeded, and it could very easily happen again, and people need to pay attention. They need to not to forget this case, and they need to draw the lessons from it so that it does not happen again.
So I encourage people who are watching to put questions in the chat. And I just want to make one more comment about the book before we start taking questions, which is about the quality of your journalism. I am a journalist, and I was really, really impressed by the reporting that went into this book. I mean, you faced many, many obstacles, and yet you managed to get the two brothers to talk. You looked at the grand jury testimony that's often, secret testimony. You looked at a lot of other documents in order to sort of lay bare the complexity of the story. And I think, it's very commendable, and it makes for a great read too, because you have so many fantastic details. So I wanted to just tell you that I'm really impressed by that, and tell people who are reading, this is one of the reasons the book is just such a fast read and such a compelling read.
Okay.
So I don't know, Kathleen, if you want to look at the questions or what.
Yeah, we have a question, Scott, from John Bernier.
Okay.
And he says, Scott, what was the most reluctant person to give an interview, and which person provided the most interesting insight to the station fire?
Wow. There are certainly the brothers reluctant, and that took a long time to happen. I will say that many of these interviews were surprising and painful for people to live through again. I'm thinking about, even if I was just doing a fact check with somebody, would often end up in tears, and things would go on for hours. But I will tease you a little bit and tell you about one of the interviews that was very unexpected, and that was with Matt Lauer. So Matt Lauer makes an appearance in the book. He has a role in this disaster that I didn't expect to find out, not in the cause of it, of course, but in the aftermath. And it just happened that at the time that I wanted to talk to Matt Lauer was right when he was fired from the Today Show for that sexual misconduct controversy. And so Matt Lauer wasn't talking to anybody, least of all someone who does reporting for a newspaper that had been very aggressive in reporting on Matt Lauer. So he was hard to get, and that took over the course of months, maybe more than a year, trying to reach him using everything I could find, friends of friends, those type of things. Nothing worked at all. And then I tried to play a hunch, and next thing I know, I get a phone call, and it's Matt Lauer. And Matt Lauer vividly remembered his association with this disaster, and had really helpful details, corrected things that would have been an error had they made it into the book. And so I did not expect to hear from Matt Lauer. I did not expect Matt Lauer, frankly, to have a role in this tragedy, but he does. And that's a really interesting moment in the storytelling.
We have another question from an audience member, Stephen, and he wanted to know, what are the brothers doing now?
So both of them went on to have lives. So not to get too ahead for people who want to read the book, but there were consequences for them, criminal consequences that happened as a result of all of this, but they have gone back to their lives. I think every person who was involved with this tragedy, they are different people now, certainly than they were before. And many of them have had a really, really tough time coming back from this. The brothers, I think it's fair to say that there's not a day that goes by where they don't think about this, and where they don't think about their role in it. So whether or not you decide, when you're presented with all of the evidence in the book, whether they're guilty or not guilty of what they're accused of, the fact is that they feel responsible. This was their business. These were their patrons who perished or were hurt. And so they play out the what if in their head every day. What if we had never bought that club? What if we had never booked that band? What if we had gone and overridden the local fire laws and told the owner of the building he had to install sprinklers? I mean, that's a stretch. Generally, renters don't go to their landlord and say, you need to do major revisions on your building. But you play all of these things. What if I had anticipated? What if it's just a million of those type questions. And so I think that there's a real sense of responsibility, and I think guilt is a good word to use here, that they have feelings about. Whether or not they're guilty in the criminal sense is something I think the reader will decide after considering all the evidence. But yeah, that's really interesting. So they have regular jobs. Not in the media. Jeffrey is no longer a reporter and has no interest in going back to that world. So, but they have, and you know what? I will say this: they never moved away. I mean, all those years after the fire, when there was so much anger and so much rage, and at one point, the local newspaper actually printed their home street addresses in the paper. And I don't know if that was, they were trying to intimidate them. Certainly Frances would know that's a huge no-no. You just don't do things like that. Today we would call it doxing, is that right? In the modern sense. So despite that, and despite those efforts to demonize them, certainly, they never faced the type of maybe harassment or violence or confrontation. So they never moved away from their town, from their state. They lived in those homes all those years after the fire. It's really kind of amazing that the depictions of people in the media are sometimes different from how real, average, everyday people greet them in real life. You know, we worked on this book over the course of years. I worked on it and interviewed them, and I would go out with them for lunch or something like that, and we'd be seen in public with them. And there were never any confrontations. And in fact, sometimes people would come up and like give them a hug and felt that they had, that they were victims of this awful tragedy as well. So it was just really, really fascinating how people go on after something like this.
We have another question from John Stuber. He wants to know, was there anyone you really felt that you needed to speak with, but they just wouldn't meet or relive their story?
And that was fascinating that almost all of the lawyers involved with this, though most of them spoke to me, met with me, talked to me on the phone, they were hesitant to do on the record, sit down interviews, which I think is fascinating and maybe a little bit telling. The fact that that was something that now I'm not saying they weren't helpful. A lot of people were helpful in a lot of different ways, but the on the record, sit down, be a major character in the storytelling was something that I would say none of the attorneys were willing to do. The one person who was the exception to that was this guy, Max Wistow, who was represented the victims in the civil lawsuits. Max did meet with me. He was very forthcoming. And I have to say, he has one of the quotes of the book. And that is really interesting because I say that in my mind, like one of the most important quotes in the book. And then some person on Goodreads or something actually copied and pasted the quote in her review and said, this is important. Pay attention to this quote. And I was just fascinated because this is a book that's 300 pages long. And this person agreed with me, this random person who knows nothing about this until they picked up the book said, yeah, this is an important quote.
And then we have another question from John. It's, what is your relationship with the fire now that is different from before you started looking into this story?
I think that anyone who pays attention to this and sees that video, which I don't recommend you look at, you will look for fire exits when you go to places. I was at a concert at the Bill Graham Auditorium in downtown San Francisco in December. And I remember thinking, wow, we're not going to get out of here alive if something goes bad. I went to an Ed Sheeran concert in Foxborough, Massachusetts, at the big football stadium. I'm looking down at my feet saying, no way do I have the requisite 7 square feet apportioned to me at this moment if something were to go bad. And so you do take notice and you say, I need a plan, I need an exit plan. And you'll do it at restaurants, you'll do it at movie theaters, you will take notice of how to get out. And I would say that that really sticks with you. And I'm not the only person who feels that way after learning about this tragedy.
Okay, there's another question from Stephen. It's, in Oakland, there was a lot of criticism of the local regulatory agencies. Did that happen here?
Yes, and in fact, I would say that kind of a classic moment, and I do write about this in the book, a classic 60 Minutes moment. So after the fire, Scott Pelley, who's a correspondent for 60 Minutes, does an interview with a person who's national figure who really helped set the fire codes. Like there's this question like, why didn't this building have sprinklers? Why isn't that required by law? And basically 60 Minutes drills into this and looks and says, basically, clubs of a certain size or venues of a certain size would have had all of this safety precautions by law, but under a certain size, not so much. And so in a classic 60 Minutes moment, and I don't know if the guy was sweating or in my mind, I saw the guy sweating. He says, well, why is it that, X number of people's lives are not important, but X plus one is? And of course, the guy can't give an answer. Within a few days after that interview, they changed the codes. They changed the codes to require that, that everyone gets protection, whether it's a small venue or a large venue. So yeah, that kind of a classic turn of events happens because of that tough question. And frankly, because of 60 Minutes. And there was not a movement to change those things before that story.
We have one more question from Juliet, and she wanted to know how you decided on the structure of the book.
That took a long time. I mean, there's part of the challenge of doing something like this is that it's not only about what you put in, it's also about what you leave out. I mean, there were millions upon millions of words written about this tragedy. The grand jury, previously secret grand jury transcripts alone are tens of thousands of pages. And so there's so much to consider. So in the end, though, it really comes down to a lens, picking a lens. And the lens I decided was to pick those handful of people, the few to represent the many. And once I had determined who they were going to be, and that took an awful long time, the story begins to make sense. You see it through their eyes, and then you pepper the journalism around it. But you never stray far from the individuals. And you see things through this kind of very, very, very close third person point of view, kind of challenging to get it. It was a really painful process for the people who trusted me and told me their stories. We would revisit the material again and again and again until we got to that level where I felt like I was in their head and seeing things through their eyes. And once I got to that, it kind of all begins to make sense and the story begins to emerge. But you had to get there, and that was a long process.
Well, one of the things that really struck me is I remember when this happened. The band never, ever took any kind of responsibility for lighting those pyrotechnics.
No, they did kind of pass the blame. I mean, it was really, and that was, people to this day feel like they've never got a heartfelt apology from Jack Russell, the lead singer of the band. He's not a well-liked person back there. And it's really interesting that Jack Russell, out of all the people who I spoke to, and I spoke to him a little bit here and there, and I went to one of his shows, he was a person who asked me for money. He asked me for money in order to tell his side of the story. So in the end, he would not sit down and do a formal interview and answer all the questions that everyone else did. So that doesn't mean we don't hear from him. And in fact, one of the revelations of the book is that we learn about Jack Russell's very, very, very serious criminal past, like going to prison criminal past, that no one knew about at the time of the fire. It was never reported, which is kind of astonishing to me. Did you have somebody close to a tragedy like this involved in what was basically one of the largest criminal cases, one of the deadliest criminal cases in the history of the United States? And I don't think the prosecutors, I'm not convinced that the attorneys involved in this case knew that he had a very, very serious criminal past. So yeah, no, that was something there was a lot of finger pointing, a lot of pass the buck. And we take a really close look at that and look at some of the claims that the band has made over the years and whether or not they stand the test of time.
We have one more question from Juliet. She wanted to know if you let the people you follow in the book, were they able to read the book before it was published?
They did get copies of it just before it was published, but what was unique was that for their parts of the book, the scenes that they are in, they saw every word of it before the book came out. That was part of the process. A little bit different. Frances and I have talked about this before. I basically would do an interview, write up a chapter or a scene, and then take that draft back to these people. These are only the central subjects. Not everybody in the book got this privilege. And I would sit down with them and do a kind of a table read, print it out on paper, and we sit there and we go through it word by word, every noun, verb, sentence, paragraph. They had to say, yes, that's what I was thinking at that moment. Yes, that's what I was thinking. That's what I was seeing. So this was a really important part of my journalism process for accuracy. But what happened as a result of going through that second layer was that a lot of other new information bubbled up, really personal things, personal insight. So in some ways, this reads like a novel. I think it's referred to as a nonfiction novel because you have this intimacy. And that's because I was willing as a reporter to do something unusual, which was I'm going to share my process with these people. Now, they didn't get to read other people's scenes, only their own, and they got to really chime in and make sure that I got it right. But that process led to a whole different level of revelations and insight from these folks. So the portions of the book that are about them, yes, they saw all of it except, of course, the final draft. And then I did get the books to them in advance of the publication.
And another question that I have is, how long did it take you to write this book? Because I mean, it's so detailed.
I think, it's interesting that people want to know about, like, how does a book like this come together? With a nonfiction book, you have to write what's called a proposal. So it's different. I've written a couple of novels, had a couple of novels published. Novels are delivered complete. You might go through an editing process after the publisher buys it. But with nonfiction, with true stories, you write a proposal. And the proposal consists of kind of an outline of like who's going to be in the book, what do you think of the chapters, how do you think it's going to unfold, and then you write a couple of sample chapters. Well, I ended up writing like 4 sample chapters because I was really eager once I got going on this project to see it come through. And so I had a pretty good idea of how it was going to, but that took years to get to that point. I will just tell people who are interested in writing a book, my proposal was 96 pages long, which is a lot. But I think the book sold fairly quickly, I think in part because it became clear that I could write the book because I had seemed to have written so much of it just as part of the proposal. But yeah, and no one pays you to write the proposal. You are on your own, you have to self-fund that. For me, because I live in California and because all of the story takes place on the East Coast, this involved traveling back and forth over the course of many years just to write the proposal. And then the book itself was a few years to write. There was somewhat of a pause in the middle of the writing of the book at a family tragedy. While I'm writing this book, my mother was killed by a reckless driver. So here I am writing this book about people and their families and losing loved ones and feeling that the system let them down. And something very similar happens to me with my mother's death. Reckless driver kills her. He is never tested for drugs or alcohol. The prosecution drops the ball. He's never held accountable. And so I came to this story while I was writing it in a kind of a personal way, could feel on a much smaller scale, obviously, what these people felt who felt that they were denied justice, that they didn't get a proper investigation, or that the people were not held accountable for what happened to them. So I could relate somewhat to what they did. And I think, honestly, that did help in finishing this book and in getting it to a kind of having some impact, because something similar happened to me and to my family.
So we have a comment from Julie Dempsey, and she said, I'm very excited to read this book. I've just ordered it and it will arrive to me in Australia in 26 to 41 days.
Okay.
So it's going around the world, Scott.
Yes, it is going around the world. Yes, thank you, Julie, for ordering the book and getting it out there. So.
Well, I just wanted to let everybody know if they wanted to order the book tonight, they can order it online at www.ggpbooks.com. And I think we can probably get book plates, can we, Scott?
Well, Kathleen, I will come over and sign whatever books you want me to sign. If you want to sign,
so if you want to sign books, Scott would love to sign a book. You can just put it in the comment section of your order. And I think, Frances, you had something to say?
All I gotta say is I have my book I bought from GGP and it's not signed. So Scott,
Well,
I want you to come.
I will
to my
take care
house.
of that, Francis. I will take care of that for you.
No, I was just gonna make a pitch for people to buy their Christmas and Hanukkah books at GGP. I mean, it's such an important bookstore in terms of like the culture that it creates in Oakland. And you know, Kathleen is such an amazing cheerleader for writers, and you know, you're so important to so many of us. And so I think, you know, if we can support you, it's fantastic. And I just encourage other people to support you as much as possible.
Oh, thanks, Frances.
You're here.
I feel very, very lucky to be a part of this community. And, you know, that's what a Great Good Place is all about. It's about a community. And I like to say we've created, as Mike says, we've created a community of book lovers.
Yes.
So I want to thank everybody for coming. And Scott, thank you so much for being our last event of 2020. What
Wow.
a challenging year it has been.
It has been a challenging year, and thank you for hanging in there, Kathleen, really.
And, you know, it has been wonderful to end this event cycle with you. And hopefully we'll do another one real soon. So Frances, thank you for participating. And Scott, I love you dearly. And Frances, you know, I love you too. But this has been wonderful. And, you know, this book is really worth the read. I kind of dove in and I got lost in it. So, I mean, to me, that's the sign of a great book. So I highly recommend it. And thanks everybody for coming tonight.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.